Are you ready to perform at your highest potential? Thank you for joining this GP Strategies webinar, where we'll explore best practices and innovative insights to help you and your organization improve performance.
Before we get started with today's session, I'd also like to introduce you to Matt Donovan. Matt is the CLO at GP Strategies, and he brings more than 25 years of experience. Throughout his career, he has helped support a wide range of global Fortune 500 companies through significant transformation initiatives. And not only has he been recognized through industry awards, his articles are regularly published and presented at a variety of national and international conferences. He has an MS in Instructional Systems Technologies from Indiana University. So we have a great session planned today. And I would like to pass the baton over to you, Matt. It's all yours.
Absolutely. Thank you for that introduction. I appreciate it. And I know it's so great to have so many of you on the line today. And we're really excited to kind of share some of the results of what we've been finding here as we've kind of gone out to ask some of those critical questions as we're really looking at, what is the evolving role of the learning function, the learning organization in workforce transformation. And really just to kind of set the context, it really comes up from a perspective of really thinking about our key research questions, but in the context of what we've been experiencing in the past, essentially 2 years for the most part. Really thinking back to February of 2020, kind of rolling all the way through into Q4 here for many of us here in 2021. So we wanted to kind of get out and do a pulse check and see from the industry, go with some questions and get some feedback on what we're seeing in the actual space. So what are some of the top challenges learning and development leaders are facing? What are some of the key technologies? Because there's been a really robust evolution, I think, of technologies that people have been exposed to as they've had to kind of move to a more virtual environment. So what are they seeing? What's kind of being adopted? What's on the rise and what's moving out? And then thinking, even pushing out to 2025, thinking about that, what are the key skills and capabilities for L&D professionals? So thinking about in our actual industry vertical, what are the things we need to be thinking about differently in upskilling ourselves? And this is often an area that we focus on meeting the needs of so many others. We often sometimes neglect our own internal development. So as we get to better position to meet the needs of the future, how do we actually upskill internally? What's on the horizon for L&D team members, and how does that translate into new training or new offerings that are going out? And then what new job roles are really emerging for the L&D team members? What are the new functions or the roles that we're seeing kind of come out here? So these were the starting things that we wanted to go out and gather some data with from the field and the industry. So in looking at the overall, population that we had coming through. So first of all, we did pull from a global perspective. We included a good percentage from both EMEA, North America, and Asia Pacific. So we had respondents from all three key areas coming in and contributing to this. And then if you look at the spread for the industry sectors, you'll see we had a pretty comparable range from everything from education, agriculture, pharma, transportation, manufacturing, technology, retail. So it was actually a pretty broad spread in terms of industry sectors. But I think one of the other things is that we had a nice balance between those that self-identify themselves as business leaders as well as learning leaders, because we wanted to kind of get that from both perspectives as we were pulling through. So we had our key questions, and then here's the population we kind of rolled out to start thinking about those questions. Now, as we go in, before we start to hit this poll here, and we'll pull this up in a second, as I mentioned, one of the big things that we're seeing here is the role of what I would say the increasing rise of the hybrid work environment and the hybrid workforce. And so that kind of, I think, sets a large context of what we're seeing or coming into that I think, sets an overall global context for how folks were responding to this as well. So I'd like to see from you, let's go ahead and open it up. And I'd like to see from our folks on the call today, where are you currently working? What are we seeing across the board here? Are you working fully in person? Or are you working fully remote? Or are you in a blend of where you may spend some time remote, some time in an office with some type of regularity where you're kind of between two spaces? So And that's individually where you are and what you're seeing for yourself. So I'd like to see y'all respond if you don't mind. Give it just a couple more seconds here. All right, why don't we go ahead and can we share the results? What are we seeing here?
Yeah. I'm just closing the poll. It'll just take a few minutes and then I'll post them as soon as I get them.
So as I was saying before, I think this has been one of the in terms of disruptions and what we're facing, the evolving nature of where we do work, when we do work, how do we enable a workforce, I think are all very important threads that kind of come through the entire offering that we have here. So, all right, so a lot of folks are really in that either working fully remote or in a hybrid with some degree with that, and only 2% are really working fully in person right now. So as we know that, it'll continue to probably evolve and change, but as shown by here, we're heavily represented by either a virtual work team or a hybrid, even on this call. And so just if you took, I would say these numbers 2 years ago, it would be very different. And I think that that's fairly apparent, but even in the think of answering these questions with where you're working and when you're working, you can imagine how it starts to shade some of the results that we get. So what do we find? So we have some key findings that we're coming out of this. And one of the first findings is that really from the top challenge that we're seeing from L&D is really around upskilling the L&D team members and having a plan for innovation around the corporate learning capacity. So, and I like to think it's really around that. How do you get into a sustainable approach to bring in innovation in a sustainable format as you're really moving forward around that? So when you look at this, when I would like to hear from you guys and see how you would match up here. So I picked a couple of just the subsections of what we found, but let's take a minute here and share out what you're seeing. What is your top challenge that your organization is facing, you or your organization? So let's take a couple minutes here and select the top one, which is your top, and let's see, we'll kind of see where we come back on this, and I'll show you what the results from ours was. All right, so how we doing on the poll results? Are we getting pretty good return?
Yep, we are
Fantastic.
pretty good. I would give it just maybe another 10 seconds or so. There's some people out there that are really thinking about putting a little thought and effort.
And I know we're kind of forcing you into one. I'm sure that there's a couple more around here. I'm sure that that is. Even when I look at this, I'd be frustrated because I'd want to pick several as I'm kind of going through to do. So probably there's a couple, but we did kind of push you into picking one here. So.
All right, so
Yep.
I just close it out. It takes a minute.
Oh, wow. Okay. So we have an overwhelming around measurement of learning is a top one around 35%. Great. And then the others are kind of split between buy-in from business leaders, and then we have upskilling, and then understanding the ecosystem of partners is kind of third within that. So let's take a look at how it kind of from our population at that time kind of came out here, and you'll see measurement of learning was right at about 35% of our population, but the top one was really upskilling learning and development professionals at about 43%. At the top was I think on that mindset. And I think when you come into really looking at how are you going to bring in the more, what I would say, modern, blended, virtual, doing that really, really well, because we need to be able to hit our hybrid and virtual and support them really well. I think that's important. So that shift to digital thinking, how we do it differently, how we do it effectively, is really on that presence of mind. Number two really came around the innovation of learning. Measurement of learning was still very long, very much on it. What's interesting is reducing cost per person of learning is still, I think, a factor that comes into play across the audiences. And then we still kind of round out with buy-in from business leaders, and then the latest ecosystem is still on here as a relatively high. But this is kind of where, from our population, what was on their mind as they're looking at the challenges that they're facing. So let's take a look at the second finding as we're coming in here. And I think really this is the use of technology and personalization are really seen as mainstream expectations. And I think, for many of us in our personal lives, we have access to digital technology, and we as consumers in many ways, we interact with it. We have a personal device, and there's a whole consumer experience that's really wrapped around that. So I think the concept of technology and really around a personalized experience is something many of us are seeing in our day-to-day personal lives, and those expectations are coming into full force into the workspace as well. So I think that is one of the bigger things that we're really seeing kind of come in to the audience and saying, hey, they're not expecting the same old experience. They want to have the same kind of positive user experience across the table with that. I think when you look at the innovations, and this is where, innovation is kind of where it meets in the organization. So keep in mind that across all the industry verticals in here, how they kind of think about the innovations that they're coming in and what they're being exposed to, it is highly contextual with what their benchmark for innovation may be. But when you look at this, like for example, virtual online learning is probably one of the biggest things that they had to really figure that out. And what I'm talking about here, I think this comes into, it is something different than just what we did pre-pandemic related to VILTs. Now the question is, it's mission critical to get it well. We have so much of it going out. Concepts like Zoom fatigue and how you design for that are now becoming important design considerations we have to wrap around that. But getting it right around virtual online learning and doing it well, I think there is a shift in the way we're looking at the technologies. It may not have been just, hey, we adopted it, but the question is, how are we actually integrating it well? Virtual reality is definitely up there. We saw a lot of research starting to come out around that, showing where you're seeing virtual reality is becoming a much more of a, I would say, a feasible alternative to come in and do that. There's also been efficacy studies around how well virtual reality compared to like video-based or some virtual alternatives, getting more hands-on in that. So there are a variety of techniques to be able to do that. A lot more experimentation around that. Artificial intelligence for learning. I think this gets around some of that, leveraging in to create those more personalized experiences. Increase of mobile, so it's not just thinking of just a laptop or a desktop, but you're already really thinking about the full ranges of devices that we're seeing. So most everything in that XR family has popped here, and I would call extended reality to include, virtual reality, augmented reality, etc. So you're seeing that there are definitely things across this list that are popping for new technologies. We also see, podcasts, badges, and gamification are new things that are kind of coming in as part of other platforms and are being blended in. So we're seeing those pop as well. So when you look at this on average, we see more about, it's going to remain online post-pandemic. I think this is the big question, saying, it's testing the premise that will things go back to the way they were before? Or do we see, specifically around soft skills, how we kind of bridged the gap to say, hey, we think we can actually now do these virtually or at a distance? And for me, I think this is a shift. If you were to come back to look at it historically, a lot of folks may have held that, hey, if you're going to run leadership or a soft skill, you probably need to have a face-to-face component. We need to come together and be able to do that at the same time and come through it. But we're actually seeing some penetration that we've proven in the past 2 years that we can do it effectively. I think the question will be, as the world continues to adjust and react to this, how long will we really sustain this? And I think it's actually, for the first time, really going to start and stay more online with it. So, but again, it's that transition. It is important to understand for different industries in different situations. Obviously, if you are in a manufacturing space and you're creating a product, coming together to be able to do in the product and be able to do training because you're already physically together may make more sense. But as you look at it, if the work can be done virtually, can the learning be done virtually as well? And I think that's the big question of what we're seeing in here. So when you really think about this, that there are some key differences between learning and business leaders that really are taking a look at the programs post-pandemic. So if you think about it compared for learning leaders around this, they're more likely to say the DE&I programs are likely to remain online post-pandemic than the business leaders at 42%. But flipping that around, if you're looking at the business leaders, they're more likely to say that new hire orientation and onboarding are going to more remain online than learning leaders themselves. Again, it almost flips to 46 to 42%. And then the last one is really that learning leaders are more likely to say that leadership is remaining online than the business leaders. But we are actually in both sides of this. I would say it's pretty strong across the group to show that it is much more of an open and endorsement for being able to say, yes, we can do some of these effectively. If the work can be done virtually, can the learning kind of follow suit and be able to effectively deliver that? So bringing us into, as we take a look around finding three, I think this one is around team members that are primarily business rather than traditional learning and development. So this is coming in and saying, where are the key areas of upskill for the L&D team members? What areas are they focusing on? What are we seeing from them as well? So let me take a look at here and share with you that the highest thing that we had rated here was business acumen, for example. And this was, identified that these are really things that we feel that the learning space needs to better understand as they're working to create what I'd say really fit for purpose solutions that are going to drive business outcomes. Business acumen is a key component. Another one at a strong 84% of down here in the middle is commercial acumen. And when we kind of think about business versus commercial acumen, we're really looking at the difference between, thinking about how does the business, work and make decisions internally, and the metrics and how we measure that versus the commercial acumen is better understanding the competitive market and the external component. And so depending on how they kind of looked at that, kind of pairing those together, it's really understanding that true internal, external, competitive, and business drivers so that the solutions when they're coming out are really fit for purpose around that. But I think, internal marketing and communication have always been strong, but we know that in the space of, I would say, a huge amount of data and information and so much coming through digitally, it's so many channels. I mean, we now think about this from an email standpoint to an instant manager to a Zoom or a Teams meeting to a Teams channel. All of that we have so many mechanisms of communication, really understanding how to get the right information out, to draw attention to communicate, the goals is really going to be important. And then the data analytics and measurement, also knowing here, how well are you doing? How are you going to be able to use data to make informed decisions on the efficacy of a program, where to strategically make changes on how to better tie it to outcomes. So being able to have the data to support, informed decision making is going to be really critical within that. So I'd like to just take a second here and pull to the chat window, and I would love to hear from from the group here, which ones are you seeing? If you had to just pick one in here, which is one that you're kind of facing out of these spaces? So as you look at the range from business acumen down to understanding the neuroscience of learning, when you're down there at the bottom of that, how would you actually, which ones are you guys seeing, you folks? And just go ahead and pop it in the chat. Would love to kind of see what your challenge, what you're seeing as an important skill for L&D professionals. And if you don't have something on here and you want to add something, feel free to drop that in as well. Business underlies everything. Absolutely. I think it's great. Business acumen definitely pops. Great. Understanding the neuroscience of learning. That's good. Great. Oh, growth mindset. That's a good one. And I think when you really look at, the disruptive times and the amount of change and disruption that we have, definitely growth mindset is something that we've been talking about with a lot of individuals. And I'd say in the actual L&D space, this is probably a key area for how do we think about it differently solving solutions, bringing new problems. Growth mindset is really critical. I like that ad. Learning experience design, that's a great one as well. We got a couple more on growth mindset. Inclusive mindset, that's great. I like that as well. And that, I think, is really when we talk about something around transformational diversity and inclusion. When we think about workforce transformation, being able to design programs that are taking and engaging and making accessible to the full workforce is absolutely critical. So not just having an inclusive mindset, but it's an inclusive mindset as part of the design and the approach that you're rolling out. So not only are you making the solutions available, accessible, engaging for those audiences, so you can actually tap the full workforce to fill those critical skill gaps. I love that. Neuroscience of learning, absolutely. What are we seeing from the evidence as to what works, what doesn't, which is nice. I think that the neuroscience of learning, building upon what we've seen in adult learning research, kind of building upon that great body of work, we have some great indicators that there are some ways that we change how we design, the way we go to launch with some solutions. So for example, I would say, pre-pandemic, we still even saw a heavy dose of face-to-face. And when I say this, I'm not saying that face-to-face isn't important. There are reasons to come together, but it should be one of our most precious commodities. But we do know that, historically from adult research that, a 2-day, deep intensive workshop that's separated from when the application in the field may actually be, so I learned something way in advance and then I'm going to apply it, 6 weeks to 2 months later, is probably the likelihood that I'm going to remember a lot from that workshop to that point of being able to do it. So now we look at things that we know from research tend to work better, like spacing out learning, for example, being able to overlay what we're feeding the structure of new concepts and applications, overlaying that with the actual work environment. We know that those are effective strategies from both an adult research as well as the neuroscience kind of playing into that as well. So how we're able to kind of transition it to not only retention, but transfer of learning. So that's great. I love that. Influencing business leaders are a couple great out there. Data literacy, absolutely. I think that's a great one around data literacy, and that's a definite important component where being able to, and that fits into the data analytics and measurement is really coming in, is not only being able to construct the right ways to gather the data to feed the future decisions, but being able to make insightful conclusions from the data you do get back. So absolutely, and I think that being able how to tell a narrative using the data is definitely one that pops. Well, let's kind of jump forward here on to finding 4 as we're going through. I think taking a look at this one, the golden age of corporate and higher education partnerships is here. And what really is coming out and seeing here are a couple of dimensions within this one. And so that many of the organizations that we talk to are really looking at partnering with colleges and universities for accreditation. And with those that aren't doing it, there is a strong expectation that they will be doing this by 2025. And I think this gets tying back to the, when you look at the overall upskilling, this is how I kind of look at this. The upskilling activity is that with the new emerging skill sets that we have, there probably isn't one single holder of all knowledge that takes us from key concepts or high level competencies to actually executing in a job or role or function. So what you're seeing is organizations are starting to come together and partner with institutions, colleges and universities, as well as industry groups. So you're seeing a 3-part partnership to really meet these emerging needs. And as they start to evolve more rapidly and going out there, you need to be able to consistently evolve, update, and move that out there. And historically, colleges and universities have been a little slower to be able to kind of meet what I would consider really around role and job functional, filling those gaps as quickly as possible. So being able to move at the speed of business, we're seeing some really interesting partnerships in that space. So as you look at that, about just under 49%, just about half that are offering something in that accreditation space. And then it jumps up again when you're going to do it by 2025. So we're seeing some real new considerations on how you're actually trying to solve those skilling and upskilling challenges in the future. All right, so kind of bringing us here to look at finding five, the audience for the L&D offerings expands beyond just full-time employees. And I think this is an important one when we really think about this from a perspective of the who, the when, and the relationship to the organization. How are they actually going to engage in the workplace and be able to support them? And so what we're seeing is that we have obviously full-time employees, which have been a core component of it, but we're also seeing not only part-time employees, but now we're seeing a rise in probably contractors or gig workers. And this is part of that shift in that transition. And then so from today to the future, this is where you see the shift between the increase of part-time employees today to the future. So you see that change in part-time, the increase in contractors and gigs. Then you're also seeing service providers as well. Really, as you start to look at the service providers around this, you're seeing them start to play a bigger role of educating them as part of your overall extension, meeting the needs of customers, et cetera. And then the last one, customers as an end part of that system. So being able to put learning systems in place that actually really do bridge across from the business into the actual consumer side. So increasing the types of consumer education that we're rolling out there as well and designing programs for them. And then I think the last one is probably the most interesting one, is really as we think about the workforce, increasing the expectation around workforce to not only include humans, but also the incorporation of bots as part of that. So if you think of like the increasing role of intelligent automation into the process, or feeding artificial intelligence, that thinking about how the humans and these bots work together to be able to provide a support for clients or customers on the other end, it's actually, we have to be able to kind of talk about how they interplay with each other, and you're actually training bots in certain ways as they learn, grow, and adapt as well. So it's an expansion. You see the growth from the before to the after, how it's really changing who we're providing services for, how we're rolling in, meeting their needs, and how we're having to think differently between what's in the internal environment, how we're rolling out internal solutions, versus now having to find, how we're going to roll out external solutions for folks that may not be full-time parts of the organization, customers, and then even bots, that may sit and, tying back to a technology to be able to bring that in. So these are all ways in which I think are expanding the design base of how we need to think about what we're bringing to the table, the solutions that we have in place. I wanted to kind of ask from the folks online here, as a population, which of these are you seeing significant growth in your area? So in the from to conference, if you wouldn't just mind dropping in the chat windows, which ones are you seeing growth in these areas immediately right now? Customers, service providers, absolutely bringing them into the change. Part-time, okay. Contractors and freelancers, absolutely. And I think that's as much as how we're delivering the business is how people are choosing to work. Volunteers, I love that one. And actually, I think that's a great one to put in here. I would have maybe tagged them under service providers, but I do think volunteers bring a new relationship to it. I love that ad. That's a great one to bring into for a specific audience, because, how much of what's the tie in the relationship for a volunteer? I think that's great. Yeah, see more training for customers and full-time, part-time than contractors due to legal issues. Got that. And I think that is some of the way, when, where, and how we do the work is how that kind of starts to come in from the population to be able to do that. So let me ask, and just for a second here, is anybody working with internal bots as part of their offering? So let me tell a narrative. So if you think of the call center space, so here's an experience. And so even if you haven't overseen a call center space, you've probably been on the other end of a customer experience where you've called into a business and you need something from them. And what's interesting is happening is that through the integration of tools and technologies, you're seeing a lot of that first layer of call handling being managed by bots, being able to come in and make decisions, route information, get them to the right person. So if you're thinking about on the back end, getting a skill-based routing platform, which allows me to kind of channel the right right kind of question to the right human to be able to help answer that question. So now you have a whole kind of way in which you're meeting a customer's need, really mapping across that. And you now see that upfront bots are doing that first engagement with them. They're sorting out their problems, maybe even doing, let me kind of ask a follow-up question, and they're getting smarter about how to be able to do that. And then you're getting to a human much further up the value chain. So you have a little more context, hopefully, about what your challenge is. And so now the human on the other side has to be able to deal with, me as the customer, as I've already progressed this. So I'm picking up the conversation as part of a longer chain, a more specific type of request. So now I need access to very specific information on time to really kind of solve the solution around that. So now we're seeing that kind of full environment that's really blending between what are the bots as part of the workflow, what are the humans doing together, how do we train them to work with each other, how do we beef up the artificial intelligence to get better at performing and responding in that first routing or engagement, or being as close to being able to show as reasonable some element of empathy, which I'm sure it's debatable as to whether a bot can truly show empathy, but at least having a more positive experience throughout the entire change. So I see some folks have shared with that. And so absolutely, I think that this falls in with, when you look at tech bots and benefit bots, absolutely being able to enable that, and then wrapping in other humans as part of the value chain to do that. Yes, happens all the time, sometimes frustrating and sometimes efficient using those bots. Absolutely. The technology is definitely still in an area of refinement, but I am amazed how much we've actually progressed in the past, what I would say 5 years or so. And sharing here, seeing bots with one customer, very interesting for annual planning and scheduling. Absolutely. I think this is, we're starting to see and creep in some interesting ways in which we have that, like I said, that interplay between those cycles. There's one area we didn't really kind of cover in here, which is kind of a separate element, but there's an underlying, I think, evolution in technology around blockchain. And it's around blockchain, and the role of that is to be able to get to one truth of an experience across an entire solution. So instead of having different pieces and parts of the value chain with different parts of the truth, we can now get into feeding both the bots and the humans a consistent, true vision of almost a real-time play of what they're seeing in the experience. So being able to pull from multiple discrete data inputs, having a more refined side of that. So we're seeing, how do I actually, as a human, how do I help you train to react and better intake that information from a single truth point of perspective. So yeah, so I think we'll see more of that with that technology coming in, and obviously we'll need more opportunities to help humans better understand as they play a very critical role in, I think, the digital transformation that we're seeing within that. So let's move on to finding 6, and this one's really focusing on new job roles that are emerging for L&D team members. So as we think about shifting to a hybrid or virtual workforce that we have across, that we need to think about how will we be able to enable and meet those needs of a changing environment. How will we do that? And so these are some of the new roles that started to show up with what we're seeing here, from a digital marketing leader, cloud platform specialist. So somebody that, if you think about it in the L&D space around this, somebody who understands, how the cloud platforms that are the disruptive cloud platforms that we're seeing in the space, all the niche offerings, how do they integrate? How do we secure? How do we, get the data out of them? How do we use them in our overall designs? So really understanding and leaning into that kind of IT type perspective from that cloud platform to really understand the tools that are coming to bear, so that we don't just wait for IT to kind of figure that out. How can we actually take a more active role from an L&D and be at the table with our IT partners to make the right decisions, and saying how we meet the full ranges of needs from the learners, whether it's, all the moments of need, from whether it's the first time they're exposed to something to when they're solving a problem, or, something's changed, how they can actually respond to that. Continuous learning, so having less discrete moments of learning, but overall meeting that continuous learning cycle at the point of performance. What I would also say is at the point of internal change, like I need to innovate or I want to grow for my next role, how can I intrinsically drive a change in a direction within that? Learning experience leader, how do you create more, what I would say, integrated, blended, but a more modern blend around learning experiences? So how do you craft an experience versus creating a course? And this is a fundamental shift as we're kind of thinking about this. So creating experience is actually more than just creating a course with the assets within it. It's really thinking about how those things combine with the role of the actual learner inside of it to create, as they take ownership for their learning journey, to really create a full experience for them. Remote work coach, this is one, is how do you enable from a coaching or a mentoring standpoint, not just the long-term kind of coaching relationships, but very, what I'd say, relevant, action-oriented types of coaching. Internal talent mobility leader, who's going to help as we think of the learners and performers in our space have that continuous evolution as they not only evolve to meet the future skill sets or the needs, but how they also drive through growth. Transformation learning leader, how do you enable a transformative workforce? How do you enable it to kind of continue to build that engine on as it starts to meet its own needs to transform and adjust? Immersive technology leaders. So when we think of like an immersive technology of putting you into an immersive VR space or bringing in a blend of like augmented reality with a virtual reality component to it, how do we actually design that so we can either show a tactical process, or how do we actually put teams of people that are virtually together into a team building exercise to solve a problem, work on communications, collaborate with that? There's a certain way in which we think about how we leverage that immersive technology to drive that. Learning design sprints. This is more integrating design thinking and agile approaches into solving the problems. When we don't know what good looks like, how can we make sure that we've got folks that can facilitate and enable that process so that it's more than just kind of creating assets and pieces, it's really building into that overall experience. Chatbot coach and trainer, enabling or extending like an AI-driven chatbot, for example, so that blend between a bot and a human, but that person that's coaching via that extension directly or enabling the bot coach for that. And then head of learning neuroscience. So what are we seeing in the latest research? How do we take that? How do we apply that to changing the way we engage or drive work? So these are all some emerging ones. Is there anything not on this list that you are seeing in your space that's kind of a new role that's out there? So if we take a minute and kind of share some of what you're seeing out there, if there's any new roles that are populating.
Matt, there was a question while those are coming in.
Yep.
If you could just expand on the digital marketing leader.
Oh yeah, okay. The digital marketing leader, I think this is one that's really understanding all the avenues of communication around digital marketing. And I think this is within, around our space for L&D team members to really understand how are you capturing the attention, the engagement of those folks around that. So how do you run the levers within an organization, those digital marketing channels? So this is more than just, pushing through your LMS. How are you using internal engagement strategies to be able to pull folks into the learning space? So it's around using digital marketing and communication strategies as part of your engagement strategy for the experiences. L&D technologist, absolutely. I would throw that in the cloud platform specialist related in that, absolutely. More transitional, the newest, the shifting facilitator role and a blended delivery model, absolutely. I think that is not just being able to say, can I show up and do the share screen in a website? Can I actually create breakout rooms? Can I design an effective, engaging experience that allows us to bring on more integration in that? How do I facilitate that? With that, I think the facilitator, we'll also see the rise of the producer role with that as well. So Dale, I think that was a great addition with that one. Content curation is a great one. And this is an interesting one as we think about curation strategies versus some of our traditional push-based approaches. Content curation is meant to be really a pull-based strategy. So as a user consumer, I go out and get what I'm looking for, and that can be curated for me. I can curate for others, but the idea is that it's more of a pull than a push. You must read this versus you may find this interesting. And when you do feel that you find it interesting, you can find it and get access to it. So really being able to design curation that gives you enough context to be able to assess, is this going to be relevant for me? Being able to structure it so that I can find it, but also create space so that my role as the owner to be able to come in and really drive through to relevance. I've got space to engage and interact with the materials to be able to get the most out of it. I can identify a self need I have, and then I can identify the resources that I need from a range of sources and almost kind of create and build what it is I need, whether I'm trying to solve a problem around something I'm seeing in the field or organizing resources for the first time I'm learning on something. And Chad, I see you have a question. How many of these roles could be combined rather than creating new roles? I think it's a great question. How many fundamentally? I think it gets back to really looking at, there are some key elements, that there are some things that are different here. So could they be combined into an actual role? Like one human does a couple of these? Absolutely. But I think in some of these, there are aspects or domains that are actually kind of unique to each of these, but you could easily roll them into a role or a function and call it a new title or something like that. But it is a really important question around that. I think new skills and mindsets do roll up under this, and I think that's where the prior slide of some of the key areas do feed into this. But it also gets into some of the new structures. So for example, if we are going to drive in a sustainable approach to innovation, that's a framework to kind of create like an innovation space where you can, outside of the actual execution, you can actually bring in and learn about new tools and technologies in a proactive way rather than trying to do it at the end of a solution. So I think it's skills and mindsets. I think it's the role and function we've identified, as well as some of that infrastructure and enablement that we wrap around them to be able to do that. So it's a great comment. Love that. All right, so let's take us through here. And I think there are some key, imperatives to kind of walk away. And so what are we seeing in this snapshot of the data? Here we are, in year 2 of the pandemic that we're kind of coming in. We're looking at the next normal. And as we continue to face some disruptions, what are some, key imperatives that we're looking back and said, hey, if I had to identify 3 things that we want to do, is really embrace an agile mindset. We want to be able to respond faster and generate better results for the business. That's one. And I think this goes back, if you think back to like February or March of 2020, and I think this applies fairly globally, when the world started to shut down and isolate as the pandemic was building up in force, businesses had to really change in the way in which they think about how they came together to do work, how they connected with customers, how they learned and conducted business. All that had to change. And if you think about it, for every 30 or 60 or 90 days, you have to be able to function with that. So we don't have 12 to 14 weeks to roll out a new training solution, assuming we know what the good is. If it takes me 12 weeks to roll out a new training solution to adjust to a change in the environment, you could be out of, without being able to compete within 90 days. So what I think it's been able to show us is that, can we get in a more agile mindset, can we get good out quicker and then be able to collect data to continuously adjust and evolve as we go? So that as an L&D organization, we can be more nimble and be able to respond better as our business environments change multiple times. I mean, you think about March through July, through October, through January, and then July of 20. I mean, each of those times was a micro shift in how we connected. Will we be coming back together? What will we be doing? Will we even go back at all? All those things kind of kept changing. So not only being able to sustain one change, but a system of changes. So embrace that agile mindset, come up with ways that we can get to good quicker rather than perfect at a much longer frame. Empower the learners to earn transferable credentials for workforce training programs. I think It's being able to meet them where they find value, but it's also critical to bring the learners into the system. And I mean, this is probably one of the things of the future is we have to set an accountability expectation that learners will take accountability for being able to respond to the change that we see out there. So they have to be part of the equation. Now, I'm not saying we just say it's all on you to go figure it out. The role of the organization is to be able to create the ecosystem that surrounds it, put critical resources in place. But instead of the learners being traditionally consumers of outputs of the organization, you now see them being much more active participants. And as they start to get into that, how do we get access or representations of what they're doing that gets transferable beyond the business in and of itself? And then the last one is really extending the education training beyond the boundaries of the traditional organization, incorporating, coming up with inclusive designs, thinking not only diversity, inclusion, and accessibility, but also when and where and how I'm connecting and working with the business for gig workers, customers, and bots. So I think these are some really great ways. Yes, and I love the prompt for the questions we have in here. I think when you look at this maturity model to become and be a more transformative talent builder, we're really looking at progressing from being reactive or responsive, which is, some of the organizations were struggling, some were actually more along this curve. But if we try to go from reactive and responsive to actually being visionary and transformative on the other end, that's where we really want to shift, and being able to do this sustainably in an age of disruption. So this is really kind of some of the key ways we kind of start to look at those steps, and really getting to, being able to anticipate, see the trends and signals in the space, and start to be able to adjust for those as we're going through. So I think, coming together here as we kind of open up for some questions for folks, what are 5 actions to really take now? Mapping the learning strategy into metrics to business transformation readiness. I think this is being able to collect the data, get the infrastructure, the architecture in on how you're going to gather data, not just from the learning space, but the business, and connect that all together. So you can actually provide an end-to-end view of that gives you insights, and that narrative of how efficacious your solutions really are. Really develop the technology and the business acumen for the learning organization. So better understand the tools and technologies that are coming to play in our space, and then thinking about how you start to integrate those into really driving and enabling business outcomes through human performance. Unleash the potential of emerging technologies and human capabilities. One of the engines we talked about this is really thinking around bringing in a proactive innovation approach, one that's sustainable, so you can learn more about the tools, the technologies, and how it enables the humans to really come into a proactive approach. Create new partnerships to provide credentials, so looking beyond the boundaries of just internally to be able to meet all the needs, really bringing in industry and where we're looking at corporate, academic institutions really kind of come for that next generation upskilling program. And then the last one is really, obviously, fully reimagine learning. I think now is the opportunity to kind of continue to question some of those things we've assumed to be true, the historical challenges that have been frame factors that have said we put us in a box, we have to structure this way. We've seen over the past 2 years that we can make a change. There are differences, approaches, they are sustainable and can be effective. So appreciate that. I think it's fantastic. Number 5 is my number 1. Chet, I appreciate that. I think this is probably the biggest thing is, and I've historically talked about, establishing a 4.0 mindset versus a 3.0 mindset when it comes to design, development, engagement. It's really thinking differently. I mean, when we're presented with a 4.0 problem, we can either have a 4.0 mindset or a 3.0 mindset. If we keep coming at it with a legacy mindset, we're going to keep facing the same challenges we have. We do need to think differently about it, but there are processes where you can bring in design thinking and agile development to kind of help get to what does good look like, being able to really push the boundaries around that ideation phase, question and challenge some of the legacy principles that we felt that we've been shackled by. Great. I love that. Any other questions we have out there? I know we're kind of coming up on time, but I appreciate all the time today to spend with you. any other questions coming in so far?
I have a question
Yep.
that we want to ask, but before we do that, I just want to remind everybody who's on that we are going to be sending a copy of the report that this research came from to everyone who registered today, and that will be coming in the email that has the recording from today's presentation as well as a copy of the slides. So let's get to one question here, which is, so how would I look forward to creating or developing or creating a map of the learning strategy and metrics
Gotcha.
to business transformation readiness?
No, I think that's great, and I think one of the tools we use, and there's a variety of tools out there, but one of the tools we use is the concept of a measurement map, and it's a way to articulate across an organization to map from on the right end of a visual layout the most lagging indicators, increasing revenue, decreasing cost, the most lagging business indicators, and as you go through, you get to less lagging indicators, you get into behaviors that are observable, and then as you're going left, mapping to the activities and then ultimately the intervention that you've put in place. So that as you go through, you can start to establish a causal link between the training initiative that you put in place and how you're actually going to measure that from beginning to end. And so the measurement map and a measurement plan are some of the key ways to be able to pull that together to do that. So that's just one technique and approach. We've actually fleshed out each of these 5 in the report. So there's several underneath each of these 5 recommendations or actions to take now. There's definitely more of that. And so being able to share an example of a measurement map, that is a great question. We'll send out a little more information. We do have some great resources publicly to talk about measurement map to kind of learn a little bit more of what that is, what that looks like to be able to do it. I don't have the link at the moment, but Sandra, it's a great question, and we'll make sure we can share those resources. Thank you. And so, this has just been a really big component to do this that's going to come through here with this one. So anyway, the opportunity to work with Future Workplace on this and bring it forward has been fantastic. So everybody, thanks for taking time to join us today. Let's see, could I share, let's see, do I think there's any room, there's a question here, any room in the future for well-designed paper-based books? That's a great question. Do I think that paper books will go away? I think what will be interesting is I think they will change, their one format. I think there are reasons to be able to, we are sometimes tactile learners. There are people that like to feel things and connect with, and when I say tactile, I mean, to be able to become more intimate with something and read. There are people that have a preference around that. I'm not saying it's a learning style, but I might say a preference for being able to use to consume information. So I do think paper-based books still have a role out there, even if I have a digital version and I may print out elements of it. So anyway, I love that.
I love it too. I personally love to hold a good book person still, even though I do have my digital side to it as well, but I hope they never go away.
Yes, absolutely. So
all right, well, great.
Anyway, yeah.
Thank you so much, Matt. I really appreciate you taking your time to present this information for us today. And hopefully everybody who joined us today will be able to join us on an upcoming future webinar as well. So thank you again, and have a great rest of your day.
This webinar is brought to you by GP Strategies. Together we can create a world where business excellence makes possibilities achievable. You can access more webinars or download additional resources at gpstrategies.com/resource-library.